All right, I'm excited today to have with us Ali Golshan from Gretel AI. We led the seed round from our Fund 1 in November of 2019. And then we followed into the Gretel Series A from both Fund 1 and Fund 2. So one of those rare deals where we liked it so much that we invested from two funds. For venture funds, sometimes there's a conflict and you have to work through some additional hoops in order to get to invest across funds. So Ali is a serial entrepreneur, studied computer science at the University of Calgary, and worked as an analyst in the intelligence community for a number of years, 5 or 6 years. He's also a serial entrepreneur, co-founder and CEO of Seifert, acquired by Juniper Networks, co-founder and CEO of StackRox, acquired by Red Hat, and now co-founder and CEO at Gretel AI. He's extremely well known and called on frequently as an expert in information security in that industry. So today I want to go into exactly what Gretel is, the founder story, which is really important as we're making decisions about investing in companies. Let's start with that and let's hear about Gretel.
All right. So at Gretel, we focus on building what is called a synthetic data platform. For those of you who are not familiar with synthetic data is data that is generated from a deep neural net model. So what we focus on is solving data bottleneck problems. Data bottleneck problems typically sit into two categories. I have data, but I can't access it because of privacy, regulation, compliance, sensitivity. I can't use or touch that data or give the number of people I need access to that data. Synthetic data, the way we build it, uses a combination of generative AI models with best-of-breed privacy technologies to be able to train these models on that data, generate data that has the same statistical distributions, shapes, insights, structural stability. So you can do all the same type of analytics, machine learning, training, inference on it with the same results, but never actually have that attribution from the original data. So it's irreversible. It's actually what's called mathematically provable privacy. There is no way to be able to reverse that data. It's actually a really good way not only to be able to expose sort of more of your users and developers to data, but we are also seeing some initial signals where customers want to be able to use this technique to even commercialize or monetize their data in a safe way. So one side of the data bottleneck problem is I can't access my data. The other side of it is I just don't have enough data. So I have limited data, sparse data, messy data, low quality data. And synthetic models built with these deep neural net models, these transformer-based models, are really good at being able to do what's called upsampling. So ultimately, the data you have is still a subset of a much larger complete data set that you do not have. So as an example, we work with hospital systems, or in one particular case, we work with a company named Illumina, which is the world's largest genomics company. They do genotype, phenotype research. And their sort of feedback to us is that if we were to do drug discovery and trials on the data we have, we would basically only build drugs that are good for the top 1 percentile because they're the ones who can afford great care and be able to actually collect that data, and they're the only ones we would build. So what we want is actually larger demographic data from areas that we don't have access to. So that's what we do at Gretel, which is we focus on the data bottleneck problem. We happen to incorporate best-of-breed AI technologies and privacy technologies to be able to remove those data bottlenecks.
So it sounds like it's a tension between privacy and data quality.
Yes.
And how do you optimize for that? Because they seem like the more private it is, the less additional data you can add.
Yeah.
But the more you want to have more data, but you can't use any of the real information.
Yes. So this touches on one of our core differentiators. So thank you for asking. There's always been this misconception that if you have high quality, safe data, you are having some trade-offs on utility. And that's just natural, right? Like if you have 100% utility, the data has to basically look like the raw data, the original data that you have. The way we've solved this is in a few different ways, and without getting sort of too into the weeds is, we solve this with multimodality. So as an example, if you have massive volumes of tabular data, which most organizations do, That tabular data is typically not just tabular, like numerical or text format. So if you were just to apply a single model to that tabular data, learn from it, and generate new data, your utility would probably be falling because large volumes of tabular data have underlying time series components. If you're in finance or government or insurance or health, like you need to be able to understand certain things in your data, like the patient check-in has to happen before the checkup, has to happen before the prescription, has to happen before the side effects of that drug. That time series is very important. So if you just trained on a tabular model, those components would be missed. At the same time, you might have tabular data that has fields that are free text because it might be doctor's notes or emails or chats or things like that. So what we built from the ground up from sort of day zero was, and this is really credit to my two co-founders who thought about this, was if we build multimodal, we can apply the best of breed model to the modality and then combine these models and create one unified output. And we've been writing about this more recently where we've actually demonstrated that using this technique with complete provable privacy, we can get to less than 1% of difference compared to original data, which is sort of historically the best you could do was about 80%. So it's about a 20% almost improvement on that metric.
That's fantastic. So we heard Nan last night talk about the US is awesome. The US is technologically superior and faster moving and innovative. And then we put it into open source, which allows for adversaries to immediately have access to all the stuff we worked really hard to develop and build. So when you look at the race and you see it, playing out with, I'll say, open AI and other entities, talk a little bit about that race between an open and closed system.
Yeah.
And where Gretel fits in.
Sure. So closed models. So think of it as GPT-4, Gemini, Claude from Anthropic. These are models that are closed systems. Historically, they have been much more powerful and capable compared to open source models. And the reason is that if you're Google or Meta or OpenAI, you just have a lot more funds and resources to throw at building these models. Open source models have been catching up very quickly. Now, what is the difference between the two? If your requirements dictate that you need to have a lot of control, a lot of visibility into how the model works, if you need to be able to control every component of what that model does, an open model is better because it's completely visible to you. It's basically, it's called like the weights of it are available openly. So you know exactly how that model is processing, making decisions. It's not a black box, unlike a GPT-4 or a Gemini, from these closed source models. So the decision-making process is visible to you. Now, what has happened in recent, I can't even say years in generative AI, in recent months, is that open source models have started to really catch up. And the way they have started to do this is actually using synthetic data. The reason this is important, sort of a distinction, is the way Gretel fits into this is, there's, for example, one case we can talk about, like the work we're doing with Databricks. They have used us to improve their DBRX model, which is their foundation model, by about 66% from a quality standpoint, at about 1/40th of the cost of what took OpenAI to improve GPT-4. How do they do this, and how do we fit into this? In synthetic data, there's a concept called textbooks are all you need. This is actually a really great paper that Microsoft wrote. The premise of it is, if you think about what has happened in the last 4 to 5 years, is we have built generative AI on the back of training these models on very large volumes of public domain data that is messy, that is low quality, that is riddled with privacy issues. What this paper proved, and what we have been proving as part of this work that we did with Databricks and a bunch of other customers, is one of the capabilities of synthetic data is to communicate its knowledge when it learns on the raw data in a way textbooks communicate knowledge versus somebody writing a Twitter post, for example. When you do that, when you can communicate very high density knowledge to these models, you can typically train them on about 1/10 of the data you needed. You can train a model roughly 1/3 or 1/4 of the size that you were building before, and still actually exceed performance by about 20 to 25%. So this is actually where the open source and open models have really started to catch up. So if you look at, for example, recent announcements from Meta, from Mistral, which is a European company that builds foundation models. What Databricks is doing with us is they have actually been using synthetic data to improve their models to catch up to these closed system models. And they really serve different purposes, right? Closed system models are this sort of a same difference you see from open source to closed sources is that the amount of control, flexibility, and agility you have for that model. But that's sort of how we are seeing the race shape up. The way we view it is it's not how good your model is, it's how good your data is, and models are and becoming more and more commoditized. So how you differentiate these things is not by training them on general purpose data, because then you build general purpose models, right? Like these become generalized models. Like this transition we have to now manage, and this is where the privacy component of synthetic data comes in, is we now have to take these general purpose models that have been trained on general purpose data and make them domain experts. If you're in health, you want something to be able to be like a physician, not somebody who just read a blog about the health problems you're dealing with, right? If you're in government, you want somebody to understand the nuances of a geopolitical issue, and you need to train that model on different types of things. What this means is we have to find a way to plug these models and train them on very domain-specific and at the same time private and sensitive data without teaching them about the core attribution PII. So the analogy we use as an example in health is how you train these models should be you train them on the disease, not the patient. And that's really the sort of the distinction that synthetic data can bring in.
And for the application of Gretel, layperson-wise, you're creating trained templates that are specialized or sector-focused that anybody could use against a larger language model, open source or not.
No, that's exactly right. So we started with a general purpose platform because early on, especially in the last few years, the market was nascent. Everybody was doing essentially general purpose training, and they were building experimentation. And now what we're seeing is this shift where rather than doing one-off and experimentation, companies are becoming more and more domain specific. And what they're doing is moving more and transitioning more towards continuous product development life cycles. And what we are seeing is that as you go from general purpose and experimentation to domain specific and continuous product development, the deeper you go in a deeper stack you offer, you get to actually get more and more into value pricing and premium pricing. So that vertical integration is very important.
So you alluded to, it's not a discussion of a yearly changes, but monthly changes with the speed, what's happening in the sector. What do you and the team at Gretel think is like really exciting that's happening right now that's coming fast?
Yeah. There are two things. One on the privacy side. So what we use on the privacy side is something called differential privacy. It's the gold standard for how privacy should be done. It's mathematically provable privacy. The problem with it is computationally very intensive. You need large volumes of data to be able to use it. And if you have limited data, the utility can fall. There are some really neat research areas. It's actually called augmented privacy enhancements that we've been researching and we're implementing, which uses roughly 1/15 of the computational power of differential privacy, but it has the same outputs. And the way it works is brilliant. It uses a large language model, but rather than training that model on your data, basically it just keeps giving it automated prompts describing what your data looks like until that model generates data that looks similar to your data without ever interacting with your data. And once that output looks close enough to your data, then it tells it more of this now. And it just keeps prompt tuning it until it generates data. So that model generates data that looks like your data without ever seeing it, which is really great. This is obviously very important for things that have air gap requirements or highly sensitive data requirements. The other side of it is on the quality side. So one of the more recent developments we've seen is this concept of what's called agents. So what has been done so far is companies keep building these larger and larger models. And the view is like, we build a 1 trillion parameter model, it gets larger, it has more data, these things eventually become artificial general intelligence, and these things are more and more powerful. There's a lot of problems with that. The problem with that is you constantly need more data. The inference costs are enormous. Retraining these models is extraordinarily difficult. So one of the new trends that we've been sort of tracking for the last year and a half, and actually our product core platform is built on it, is this concept of called agent-based execution architectures. What agents do is it enables you to take models that are called SLMs, not LLMs, small language models, train those models on very specific domain-specific tasks. And then agents can combine these models together. So think of it as like rather than going to one professor who's emeritus with 50 years experience, you can go to 20 researchers and talk about very specific domain expertise and tie all that data together. So these agents are enabling us to be able to build what we call expert systems by combining different data sets and different expertise together and training much smaller models. So again, less data, smaller models, inference costs are lower, and this combination is building systems that are very flexible, very agile, lower cost for retraining. So if you come across a new pattern in production that you have not seen in the past, rather than training a trillion parameter model that might take you weeks, if not months, to basically reconstitute that learning, you can do this within a matter of hours. That's a really interesting development. Actually, Andrew Ng, who's sort of considered to be the grandfather of AI, has been talking and writing about this recently, and saying this is what the future of AI is really going to look like. And we actually fundamentally at Gretel believe that this is the technology and the architecture that's going to get us closer to AGI versus building larger models, because it also solves two other problems. One is the resource limitations, and one is obviously the overabundance of cost limitations that comes with training larger models.
I frequently like to refer to the Gretel team as skating to where the puck's going, because they do a lot of that. And as more and more things evolve, you see, yep, that's how we were structured. That's why we built it that way. This is what we anticipated was going to happen. So for this group of people, I think it's easy to see where there's significant commercial applications. Can you talk about some of the government, intelligence, DoD applications that Gretel could apply to, could and or is applying to?
Yeah. Some basic ones. So we're working with a military organization, and one of their core use cases is that we have 50 dispersed data sets, each of them a lot of sensitivity, lot of attribution, and because of historic issues, we just don't want to combine all that data together and give everyone access to it. So what they're doing is they're actually training differentially private synthetic models on each of these data sets and just making the data models available to users. As a result of this, they're going from giving access to 2-3% of their users to over 60% of their users access to the data, because they can now access all this data without ever seeing the original attribution, the raw data, so they're getting the insights from the data without any of the original aspects of it. The other one I can actually talk about that is not intelligence is Government of Australia's health and how they're using us. So now they've deployed us over 150 different hospitals. And what they're doing is that in their world, privacy and health is very critical. And the way they operated is clinicians only had access to data for the hospital they worked at. So now what they have done is they've used our differentially private synthetic data models to train models on all their hospital systems and use the output of those models to train a chatbot. So now a doctor can ask a question and the results will be from 150 different hospitals. So why is this important when clinicians are dealing with rare diseases in patients? Rather than seeing a handful of samples, now they see hundreds, if not thousands of samples. The other reason this is important is that because it is provably safe, when they run into limitations as to the type of expertise they have, they can go outside their network and actually pull in educational or research institutions to help them solve those problems. We're seeing the same thing actually from military and government. Basically what this does is it creates a safe version of your data that you can externally bring in resources to help with. And then the other part of it is synthetic data, especially in some military and intelligence organizations, is very effective because it does what we call reducing the economics of data acquisition. So what these transformer-based models are good at is because they've been trained on these large volumes of data, they understand larger patterns, right? They understand some of the nuances and nomenclature that goes into very specific sectors. So if, as an example, you are trying to make some predictions and you find that there's actually a black swan event that is very important to your decision making, you might want hundreds of that, but those don't happen that often in real life. Synthetic data has the ability to, and this is one of our customer calls it, create what-if scenarios in your data, where you can just natural language prompt it. What if this demographic was increased? What if this, for example, input was increased? What if we had more of this variable or more fraud in the transactions? And models in synthetics don't generate these randomly. They maintain what is called the deep underlying structural stability of the data. So when you increase one thing, it doesn't randomly boost other things. So these are some of the things that we've seen. And I'll give a very specific example. This is work we did early on with Google to sort of validate this, is we trained a model on the general behavior of how people use scooters, those bird scooters in San Diego during the summer. And we said, can we take that pattern that we learned underlying deep structural stability and apply it as to how people would use scooters in Tokyo in the winter. And because this was in 2020 public data sets, we had the public data. So we could basically train these things and compare it to the original data and see how accurate we got. And the predictions we made were roughly about 98.5% accurate, where we could learn the behaviors of people who use scooters and project them in Tokyo. And to give you a very concrete example, what we found out, for example, that these deep neural net models picked up is, one example was that they saw if somebody was coming off a train and picking up a scooter, they were more likely to travel 3 times the distance to get to a health food store versus a chain store for their groceries. And the logic makes sense. This is like, okay, they're conscious of sort of green effects. They're using public transportation. They're using scooters. As a result, they're willing to travel or basically exhaust a little bit more resources to get to something that makes more sense to them. These are things that are not correlations, and they're very difficult for analysts to do. But these are called basically projection behaviors, where these models pick up underlying behaviors that are very subtle and part of the deep structural stability of the data, but they can be used in other vectors, which is very important.
So one of the best things about being a venture capitalist and what we love about the job is investing in amazing founders who are brilliant and are trying to change the world. Part of the job is also frequently the way Craig and I invest is being a board member. And I think you can see with no aspersion to any of the other founders that I study 3 to 4 times longer for every board meeting with Alex and the team there. So let's talk about the team. I'll tell a little story. So when we invested in Gretel in 2019, our thesis is investing in extraordinary leadership. And one of the co-founders there is a guy named Alex Watson. And I think there's some fans here in the crowd who already know of Alex. We had previously invested in him. He sold that company to Amazon and rolled that product from that company out successfully at AWS, which is typically very hard. It's hard to get acquired, and then it's even harder to actually successfully deploy what you were building in your little startup into a giant company. And he successfully did that. So what was your actual role when you founded the company with the team?
I was just a board member.
So I get a call from the CEO we invested in, named Alex Watson, about a year and a half into investing and building the company. And Alex said, hey, Kelly, how you doing? We've been talking to the co-founders, and I think Ali's going to become the CEO, and I'm probably going to be the chief product officer. So for anybody who's invested or been a part of teams, and there's a CEO movement, it's literally this one time where it's a good sign. It's always a bad omen or something's going on. It's like, holy shit, like, what do we do? Who's leaving? What happened? Is there a dead body? There's always something bad about it. And I said to Alex, what was the rationale, or why is this a good? Well, Ali's much more experience at fundraising and outward facing. I really just love building product, and I really want to focus my time on building the product. And I said, okay, so everybody's happy, and this is like a joint decision that you want to. He's like, yeah. And I said, well, one thing for you to consider, there are like 4 of you on the board right now, and as the company grows and we take in additional rounds of financing, it is likely that there will be board members from those investors coming in, and that the board won't just continuously always get bigger every round of financing. And I guarantee you that as they decide who goes off the board, it won't be the CEO. And Alex went, I'll call you back in 15 minutes. 15 minutes later, he calls back, yeah, we're good, let's do it. And I'm like, okay, great. And I affectionately refer to this team as the Borg, for any Trekkies. They literally make non-ego decisions about how to execute and be successful. And can you tell from the other side of that story? Yeah. Can you explain that?
Yeah.
Because I didn't know you.
No, so you told the nice version, yeah. So to preface, so my 2 co-founders are Alex and John. by far the two of the most brilliant people I've ever met, right? Like I get to stand up here and talk about this thing, but everything I'm talking about is I'm learning from them on day to day. I'm like, holy shit, I get to talk about this stuff now. So they're the actual smart people doing the real hard work, and I just sort of get to be the face that talks about this a little bit. So before this, and you mentioned I was CEO, I was actually CTO of my last two companies. So we joke that basically the three of us have been CTOs and we drew straws, and I drew the short straw, so became the CEO. So before this, I was the CTO for another company called StackRocks. And when Gretel was founded, was me, Alex, and John have known each other for 15 years. We just love working together. Gretel actually started as an evening and weekend hackathon project because we couldn't find time to work with each other. They were advisors to my company, I was advisor to their companies. We always were just trying to find something to do together. In 2019, sort of November, December, Alex and John said, fuck this, we're tired of our day jobs, we're just gonna go build this weekend project we've been doing together, and we're gonna go build into a company. I was like, well, I'm jealous, but all right, no problem. So that's how they started, Alex as CEO, John as CTO, and I was just a board member. In late 2020, IBM Red Hat, and bought my last company. And it was a large acquisition. It was a $500 million acquisition. So, this huge retention, and they brought us on board. And 2 months in, I was like, I'm out. And they're like, burned every bridge under the sun. They're like, what do you mean you're out? I was like, I got to go work with my friends. That's it. So I was talking to Alex.
Large retention means you don't get a lot of the money that was built into the next 3 to 4 years of working.
Any of it.
Yeah, you get none of it.
Yeah.
Okay.
So we've never really done things for money, but this was especially important to do because Gretel was always sort of a vision of privacy we wanted to build into data. So originally I was coming on board because I was really passionate about running products. So Alex and I have been talking for a bunch of months, and the plan was I was going to come on board and be the CPO. I was going to run product and applied science.
That's what you were sold as.
That was what I was sold as. That's what I wanted to do.
To us.
Yeah, me too, me too. And literally a week and a half before
Alex is like, hey.
Yeah, before I started, and we have very blunt conversations with each other. Alex called me, he's like, listen, I think you should be CEO and I should be CPO. I was like, that sounds really odd, and I don't want to be CEO. Why do I have to be CEO? And he's like, well, now that I'm getting a better handle on things, the things we're doing on the generative AI side, on the privacy side, all these deep areas, you really just can't do them. I'm just much better at it. I was like, well, I'm not going to argue that. That is true. I was like, well, I'm not going to argue that. That's definitely true. And the other thing when we talked to John was, so John, our CTO, runs engineering and infrastructure, and Alex runs applied science and product.
And John's Air Force.
John's Air Force, both NSA, TAO. And the other rationale was, obviously your VP of engineering, CTO, which is John, and your head of product applied science have to constantly debate. And because they are both so much smarter and more technical than me, the other rationale was like, there's no way for me to hit bottom with John on the product side. Like at some point I just have to be like, all right, I just defer to you. And those two were just much more able to be able to go deep and sort of validate things before. So a week and a half before I showed up, Alex is like, yeah, like this is what we're doing. You're going to be CEO. I'm going to be CPO. This is just a better transition. I was like, fine. And the whole agreement we had is we just always felt that because we had a very distinct vision for what we wanted to build for the company, the founders should run the go-to-market, the product, the engineering, the infrastructure side. So basically what we agreed on is we would just run all of these things as a cohort together, and that's what we've done since. I might be CEO in title, but I really don't make any decisions without running it by Alex and John and getting on the same page. And the thing that's really great about it is we never agree, but we're always on the same spectrum, even if we're at different ends of it. So that at least helps us orient on the same one. But we're never on to like 2 different spectrums or 3 different spectrums. So it's been tremendously helpful. And the thing I told them, which I told you very beginning when I came on, is like, I'll do this as long as it makes sense. And when it's time for a different CEO, we'll make that decision. But a different CEO's got to be Alex or John. So that's it.
Do we have time for a couple? 1 minute, one question. And it's probably Rob Gordon or Lawton is going to ask you a hard question. Anybody else? Chris, want to?
I do, sure. How do you military, you're looking for something that's odd, right? And if they're predictive machines, the algorithms, and you get more synthetic data that would be kind of centered around the mean, that you would lose over time the outliers that you're trying to get to. How do you guard against that?
Yeah. So there are a few different techniques. At its core, this is called conditional data generation. It's the balance between utility and accuracy. So most synthetic companies talk about accuracy. Accuracy is the static comparison of synthetic data versus the raw data. And if it looks 99%, you're like, hey, this is great. Utility is the downstream measurement of the actual output of that synthetic data, because that 1% difference might be all the outliers that are actually important. So the way we handle this is there's an entire pre-processing aspect to our system where it's basically called gradient clipping in model training. Without going into the details of it, is what our system does is it basically, I'm speaking very generalized terms here, is when we build synthetic data, we essentially train on 2/3 of the data, and this is a continuous process. And the model predicts what is that 1/3 that it hasn't seen. And it keeps looking at seeing, okay, is it getting better? And then it gets another mix, a new 2/3 of the data predicting a new 1/3. And it does this in iterations over and over again until it finds what are the outliers that gets basically abstracted in privacy, and those become a different mode of synthetic data that at the end of the process gets augmented back. And then users, typically, especially in intelligence or finance, have the ability to say, yeah, we want to augment that or we don't want to augment that. So that's actually how they can control the output for themselves. But it's because we measure the downstream utility at inference that determines this. And this is, like, for example, very important in fraud detection.
One more? Good? All right.